Welcome to English 1120. In this first week, we want to talk about what is grammar. So we'll try to answer that question. How do we define grammar? Then we'll also talk about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. And finally, conclude by talking about why it would be valuable to study grammar. So what is grammar? Usually when people think of grammar, they usually think of the rules, right? And most specifically, they think about the syntax rules. So syntax is word order or sentence formation in English. But people would also probably include within grammar morphology. So morphology is the linguistic subfield of word formation. How do we make words using word parts? So that's the most basic parts of grammar. But other people might add some other things to grammar, like oral grammar, pronunciation. There are patterns of pronunciation that influence oral grammar. We might also talk about with written language that punctuation functions as another set of systems or patterns or rules that influence how language is communicated. And another linguistic term, pragmatics, which has to do with language use. How do we appropriately use language for different situations? Other people might also consider that part of grammar is knowing when it's appropriate to use these different structures in different situations. So grammar could mean a lot of different things, but most people think of it as being, how do we build sentences and words? Some people think of grammar as rules and what you can do and what you can't do. But really, a linguist is more likely to view grammar as patterns. What do people do with the language? Let's learn these patterns, and then let's understand why certain patterns are better than other patterns, depending on the context. Because there's many ways to do a single thing in English, but there are differences in the effects of these different ways of doing something that communicate, in general, the same meaning. Let's talk about prescriptive and descriptive grammar because this is connected to the idea of rules versus patterns. I can remember teaching a Sunday school class to probably 11-year-olds when I was newly married. And one of the girls in the class, I had written something on the board. She said, "You can't do that. My teacher at school said you can't do that in a sentence." And I said, "Well, I just did it. So I guess you can do it." And what was happening is she had learned prescriptive grammar, meaning she had learned a set of rules that the teacher had presented as this is good or correct English. And if you don't follow these rules, your English is not good. Now, the reality is whether you use correct English or incorrect English, your message can still often be understood. And linguists generally shy away from prescriptive grammar, which is telling people what they have to do. It's like prescribing a set of rules, and you must follow these rules. Most linguists would not do that. Instead, it tends to be people who don't really understand linguistics, but have learned a bit about language, and they try to impose rules on others. Descriptive grammar, in contrast, is what linguists are more likely to do. Descriptive grammar is more about just trying to understand how do people use language? What structures do they use? Why do they use these structures? When do they use them? How can these structures be understood? And how can we manipulate them? So prescriptive grammar is like a teacher telling you, you must do this, you can't do this. Descriptive grammar is like a linguist saying, I want to learn why people do what they do with grammar, and I want to better understand the processes and the systems that support these differences. So that's what we will focus more on our class. Yes, we'll learn about prescriptive grammar and what are the rules and why do people prefer maybe some rules over others, but really we'll try to understand how can we do things with English language and why are some forms better than others in different contexts. Why would we study grammar? Well, I think you can already start thinking of some ideas. First, we want to study grammar because we want to be able to talk about language, not just talk using language, but talk about language as if it's an object we could study. And so we need to have concepts and words in order to talk about it, like it's a thing that we can communicate to each other. We also want to better understand our thinking. Many linguists would suggest that language is a reflection of thought processes. So the more we can understand our language, the more we're getting closer to understanding how people actually think. And related to that is the idea of how people maybe miscommunicate what they think. And as we look at grammar, we can start understanding, well, here's maybe why there's miscommunication happening, or why there's disagreement or problems between people. It may not be because their ideas clash, it's because their interpretation of their language is clashing. We might also want to study grammar because we want to better express our ideas to others more effectively in our writing, in our communication, as speakers. We want to be able to express ourselves better and understand other people's expression. And so understanding grammar will help us understand why certain words or structures are used and how they can be more effective to accomplish that goal. But it's not just to be effective with language, it's also to be creative with language. Poets, artists, other kinds of creators don't just want to be concise and direct and clear with language, they want to be energetic and poetic with their language. And understanding grammar can also help us be more creative with the kinds of language we use. We might also think about the importance of understanding grammar so that we can understand the effect that language has on social context. If we understand the grammar, then we can understand why people interpret different grammatical structures differently and how that can impact their ability to communicate with one another. So we talked about grammar and tried to give it some definitions, talked about how most people think of it as containing word formation and sentence formation. We also talked about the difference of prescriptive grammar, which is thinking about grammar as a set of do's and don'ts, versus descriptive grammar, which is more about trying to understand what are the different things and different structures that people can create with the language. And then lastly, we tried to give some reasons why studying grammar could have a benefit beyond the linguistics classroom.